Okay, I think we have a full house. First of all, a pat on the back to you all. It's not easy to turn up on a Friday afternoon to listen to taxes for an hour. Although it is very, very important, with that said. I guess to each and every one of you, my name is Ryan. I'm from Sprintax. I can share something with you all in that I used to be an international student, so I know how it feels. Taxes can be daunting, scary. Hopefully by the end of this presentation today, you'll all be very much more comfortable, familiar with using Sprintax, but also with your filing obligations as an international student. Can everyone hear me okay on this? Okay, fine. In terms of what we're going to bring you through today, I'm going to bring you through an overview of non-resident taxes as it applies to international students and scholars. There have been a lot of changes for 2018 in terms of tax law, which I'm going to touch base on as we go through the presentation. We also had about 125,000 international students and scholars that used Sprintax last year, of which I'll share some of the data that we were able to gather from that amount of students. And finally, we'll outline how you can use Sprintax to prepare your tax return. Have you all heard of Sprintax at this point? Hands up. Okay. For those of you that haven't, it's a software that's partnered with Penn and the International Office that's aimed to help guide you through a series of tax-related questions, and then we will populate your tax returns, federal tax returns, and we can also help with your state tax returns. And then all you need to do is print them, sign them, and mail them to the tax authorities. I will leave questions at the end then. I'll be hanging around. I have a second workshop afterwards, so feel free to pop up afterwards to ask any additional questions. Sound good? All right. I do have to show this disclaimer. Tax is a little bit like your own DNA. It might seem that we're very much the same on paper, but for one small, intricate detail, we could be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So the aim of this presentation is really to give you a general understanding of tax principles as they apply to non-resident international students and scholars. So hands up, who's filed taxes in the US before? Who hasn't? Anyone scared about their tax filing obligations this year? Okay, it's a good mix of half and half there. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll be a bit more comfortable and less scared. So where to start? I guess let's look at the important dates for the 2018 filing season. And it can sometimes confuse international students that we're looking at this now in 2019. Generally, the IRS are concerned about everything that's happened between the 1st of January 2018 till the 31st of December 2018. So all of the time you've spent on US soil and all of the income that you earned from US sources during that period of time. And now what we're doing is we're looking back at that period of time by filing our tax returns to make sure we didn't overpay or underpay tax during that period of time. The filing deadline is Monday, April 15th. Don't wait till April 10th or 11th. Honestly, you'll save yourselves a lot of stress by filing as soon as possible. But keep in mind that the filing deadline is April 15th. So, in terms of differences between residents and non-residents, it can be quite difficult to understand. I guess one of the most difficult concepts to figure out is this whole concept of residency versus non-residency for tax purposes. And this, importantly, is independent of visa or immigration status. So, just because you're an international student doesn't mean that you don't have to file US taxes. It's actually the opposite. But the very first thing that's important to know is this concept of residency for tax purposes. And generally, international students and scholars who are on F, J, M, or Q visas are considered non-residents for tax purposes. What that means is different tax laws apply to you, and you'll need to file different tax forms with the tax authorities. So rather than your resident, maybe colleagues or roommates, you're treated a little differently as a non-resident for tax purposes. If you're an undergrad student on J1 and F1, you're typically given 5 years of this non-resident status. If there's any scholars or researchers in the room on J visas, you're given 2 years of this non-resident status for every 6 years. After that period of time, we need to do what's called the substantial presence test to figure out whether or not you're a resident for tax purposes. Sounds like a crazy science experiment. Essentially what it does is, once you've gone over that 5-year period, for an example, it will look at all of the days you've spent for the current year, a third of the days you spent the year before that, and a sixth of the days you spent the year before that. If that total combined amount of days calculates to 183 or more, you'll be deemed a resident for tax purposes. Good news is you won't need to get your calculators out. Sprintax will actually ask you for your entry and exit dates in and out of the US, your visa types under those entry and exit dates, and will actually figure out whether or not you're a non-resident for tax purposes. So if it's a resident, we'll actually stop you on the system, and I'll show you how that works a little later on in the presentation. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next golden question. I'm an international student and scholar at UPenn. What do I need to do for the tax season? Do I need to file? What tax forms do I need to file? So, at the bare minimum, if you're a non-resident international student or scholar, everyone has some sort of IRS filing obligation, regardless of whether you earned income or not. And the minimum filing obligation is Form 8843. I'll show you that form in the next slide. However, if you have earned US source income, maybe you're working in the library, in the cafeteria, on campus, maybe you received income. If you received income over $0, you will need to file a federal tax return for this year. That's a big change in the tax law versus last year. I noticed that a lot of you have filed last year. Big change is there used to be a $4,050 personal exemption, which meant that if you earned anything under that, you wouldn't be taxed on it. Unfortunately, since the tax laws were introduced from the TCJA, that exemption has been removed. So, if you earn anything over $0 of US source income, you'll also need to file a federal tax return in addition to Form 8843. And what is Form 8843? I suppose the sheer description of it can sound very confusing. A statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. Essentially, think of it as a declaration of non-resident status to the IRS. It essentially says, hi, I'm Ryan, I'm an F1 visa here at UPenn. These are the amount of days I spent on US soil. Please exempt these days from being counted towards that substantial presence test that I spoke about earlier on. So it's a very, very simple form. Sprintax will populate this on your behalf, which is good news. And additionally, if all you think you need to do is file Form 8843, you won't need a social security number or an ITIN to file just the 8843. That make sense? Okay. However, if you're earning income, you'll probably notice that tax has been withheld on it. And generally it's applied at a rate of 30%. However, there's over 65 tax treaties between countries all around the world and the US that aim to reduce that level of withholding, typically down to 14%, or exempt that entirely. So, as I said, when we're filing our tax returns, what we're doing is we're making sure we didn't overpay or underpay tax to the IRS during the 2018 year. So I touched base on this already, but in terms of hammering it home, what triggers a federal tax filing requirement? From the 1st of January 2018, if you've earned anything over $0 of US source income, you will need to file a federal tax return. That's important, and that's a big change from last year. And it is important to look at that US source income as not only maybe the wages that you've earned on campus, working in the library or working in the cafeteria. It could also come from a range of different sources. If you were renting your Airbnb down in Philly for more than 14 nights, if you had gambling winnings in Vegas, if you're receiving interest or you sold stocks or shares, received investment income, all of these come into that pot and the IRS want to know about it. So we do need a full picture of all the income you earned during the year. Can everybody up there hear me as well? Okay. And the next golden question is, all right, Ryan, I figured out kind of what has taxable implications. What are some of the income types that don't have taxable implications? And some of the most popular ones I have outlined here from questions we get at workshops typically. The first one is a scholarship that just covers your tuition, doesn't have taxable implications. Now, where the gray area can fall is if, portions of your scholarship are covering things like housing allowances or room and board, or you're getting stipends, grants, that generally has taxable implications. So very important here that you look at the scholarship and the income you've received, most likely from the school, and to figure out whether it just covered tuition or whether it covered other portions. If it covers other portions, generally the IRS will want their tentacles on it. Similarly, scholarship received from outside of the US. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from Ireland. If the National University of Ireland Galway wanted to pay for me to study here at UPenn, then generally in the eyes of the IRS, it's not seen as US source income. It's income from your home country. So it won't have taxable implications here in the US. Money transferred from parents or relatives overseas, quite a common scenario. America is an expensive place, I'm sure you've all figured out by now. And it's quite likely that parents or relatives would send money overseas to help with the cost of living. In the eyes of the IRS, it's not generally seen as US source income and won't have taxable implications on it. Income earned in your home country. If your Airbnb is in India or France or China, you're renting a property, maybe you're receiving other incomes from your home country, while it may be taxable at home, generally isn't taxable over here as a non-resident. Next, interest on a regular savings account. Even though it probably won't accrue enough to buy you a cup of coffee, generally it doesn't have taxable implications here in the US. Now, that might change if you had a fancy JP Morgan investment account that was accruing interest regularly. However, on a regular savings account, generally doesn't have taxable implications. Finally, the gift of money. If it was your birthday tomorrow and I wanted to give you $500 in birthday money, first of all, I'm not nice enough to do that. Second of all, the gift of money and assets up until $15,000 per annum doesn't have taxable implications. So if any of you in the room are giving gifts of more than $15,000 a year, I'm happy to talk to you after this workshop. But important to know, it doesn't have taxable implications up until that $15,000 mark. Yep. Generally, you'll get an income document like a 1099 or 1099 miscellaneous to reflect that income. We're literally just almost touching base on some of that now. This is an important slide in that I spoke about the different sources of income that you can earn throughout the year. Generally, it will be reflected on any of these three types of income documents. So, the W-2, hands up, who's received a W-2? Anyone received a 1042-S? Couple. Anyone even received a 1099 document? Yeah, sounds right. So the W-2 reflects wages, salary, and compensation that's earned during the tax year. So if I was working in the international office, if I was working on campus, I'll get a W-2 typically around January or February that reflects all of the income I earned between the 1st of January to the 31st of December 2018 and the tax that was withheld on it. The 1042-S, remember I touched base on those taxable forms of scholarships. So if you're getting stipends, grants, or awards, or scholarships that fall outside of tuition, generally that will have taxable implications and will be reflected on a 1042-S. These are typically sent out in and around March time. So if you're thinking, I probably should have received one of these, I would probably touch base with payroll or whoever's issuing out the 1042S documents. Finally, the 1099 series, there's a number of different documents. These typically reflect rental income, investment income. If you were hired to complete a project, for example, if you were asked by a company maybe to develop a website for a 2-week project, generally you'll get a 1099 miscellaneous to reflect the income earned for that project-based work. But it's very important to know that we need all of our income documents before going through Sprintax and preparing our tax return. That make sense? Great. Which naturally leads into, what do we need before preparing our return? I have my income documents, right? What else do I need? So if we have all of our income documents, we'll also need information from our passport, information from our visa, whether that's our I-20 or our DS 2019 for F or J. Our entry and exit dates in and out of the US. Very important because we need to figure out whether you're still a non-resident for tax purposes. Great place you can find this is i94.gov. Typically gives your entry and exit dates for the last 5 years. I'm sure some of you in the room might be thinking, Ryan, I've been here longer than 5 years. I've been in and out of the country. What I would say there is to try and get your tickets that were purchased for those times, or try and estimate as closely as possible those entry and exit dates for back in the past or way back when, and give a good estimate of the period of time you spent in the US and under what visa type.
What happens if you have an overlapping date? For example, I've entered today, I left, and then I also came back today. In Sprintax it says there's an overlapping date, so I just take.
So I would separate those visits out. So the visit that you had in the US, then you went home, then you came back on another date. You can actually separate the dates out on Sprintax.
No, but it says, I'm saying, like, I left the US in the morning, and then I came back in the afternoon.
What a flight. Typically, if you haven't left the US, if you were present in the US on that one day and you were still there, it's probably not even worth adding that as a visit because you were still present on that day. So you're still present on US soil for that day. Yeah, and what we might do is we might leave questions till the end, because sometimes we'll typically cover these queries. Also, I'll be hanging around anyway till the end. So next important thing to know is the income tax forms that need to be completed. And the good news here again is that Sprintax will complete these on your behalf. But for your own understanding, in terms of the federal tax forms to be completed, it's either the 1040NR or the 1040NR-EZ. Anyone care to guess why it's called the 1040NR-EZ? It's an easier document. Generally, most international students have, a somewhat simple tax return. So we would see about 70% would just need to do the 1040NR-EZ. Where the 1040NR might come into place is if you had some of that 1099 income, like rental income, or if you were selling stocks or shares, or maybe earning over $100,000 per annum. Again, as you're going through Sprintax and as you answer the questions, we will figure out which document applies to you. On the state side, state tax forms differ from state to state. If you were doing OPT in New York, you may have triggered a New York filing obligation. You may have PA. What we can also do is figure out whether you've triggered a state filing obligation, and we'll also be able to prepare the right state tax form for you. So a note on non-resident spouses. I guess no matter how much you love each other, no matter how long you've been together, if you're two non-residents in the US, you cannot file jointly on your US tax return. So you'll be treated completely separately. You'll need to file your own Form 8843. If you have a federal tax return or a state tax return, you'll need to do your own and send it out in a separate envelope. There is a caveat here. If you're married to a resident and you're a non-resident, you have the option to either file jointly on the resident return or remain single and file single as non-resident. So that option is within your hands. But if you're two non-residents, you can't file jointly here in the US. Important to know. So FICA taxes. Anyone looked at their W-2 and seen they've got Social Security or Medicare withheld? No? Oh, couple. So that falls under this FICA tax. And what FICA tax is, it's a tax we pay into that's supposed to help us when we're over the age of 65 with the cost of healthcare. In the eyes of the IRS, we're not going to be here long enough to see the benefit of paying into that tax. And as a result, non-resident international students and scholars on J1 and F1 visas should not be paying FICA. Now, there are some caveats to that rule as well. If you're H1B, J2 or TN, you are subject to FICA from the first day of employment. So it's not a blanket rule. It applies to most, but not to all. But again, as you're going through Sprintax, we'll actually look at the income you provided us. We'll be able to see if you've had FICA withheld and whether it was withheld incorrectly. And we'll then give you the next steps in terms of how to get that back. Generally, it's a case of asking your employer, but we can also prepare what's called a FICA return that you can send to the IRS to claim that FICA back. The ITIN, hands up in the room. Who's got a social security number? Most of us. Has anyone been anyone applied for an ITIN? Have an ITIN? Very small proportion. Okay. Good news is, if you have a social security number, you won't need to worry about this. If you just need to file Form 8843, had no US income during 2018, you won't need to worry about this. Generally, this is popular amongst athletes who are receiving scholarships that are taxable, but aren't working and aren't eligible for a social security number. And what they need to do then is prepare what's called a Form W7, which is an ITIN application. Because an ITIN is required on a federal tax return and state tax returns if you don't have a social security number. It is a painful process. I'm sure you're smiling there in the back. And you do need to, if you're sending your W7 with the tax return, your documents need to be certified by a certifying acceptance agent. But most of you socials, which is good news, so you won't need to worry about this ITIN process. Anyone receive a 1098T? A couple of you. So this is the single largest cause of misfiling as a non-resident. What we've seen over the years is international students are training fellow international students to use resident software like TurboTax, to use a 1098T, which they can then use to claim what's called an educational tax credit from the IRS. Unfortunately, as a non-resident, you're not able to claim this tax credit, so you will not need this 1098T document on your tax return. Sprintax won't ask you for it. Keep it in a safe place. If it's the case you're a resident, by all means you'll be able to, but as a non-resident, we can't claim the educational tax credit and we won't need our tuition statement on our tax return. That make sense? Okay. It is one of the largest causes of misfiling, so just be careful and remember, keep that in mind. 1095 series, generally international students will get 1095B or C, which reports the healthcare coverage provided. Again, it's a little similar to the 1098T in that it cannot be used to claim the credits that follow it on your non-resident return. Very few might get the 1095A where they've gone out and purchased healthcare through the common marketplace. That can be used in limited circumstances, but if you've got a 1095B or C form for tax purposes, keep it in a safe place, but we won't need it on Sprintax, and you won't need it on your tax return. State taxes. So federal taxes have their own rules. States have their own state tax rules. They have their own residency rules. It can get quite tricky. If you were in New York or Maine or Hawaii or Pennsylvania, they all differ from state to state. In terms of Pennsylvania state taxes, most F1 and J1s international students are considered non-residents for PA tax purposes. unless you aim to make PA your permanent home, if you're, if you have a permanent place of abode in the state, that can be seen as your intention to stay in Pennsylvania long term, and as a result may be classed as a resident for state tax purposes. Again, there's different rules here. What we will do on Sprintax is, based on the income you provided, we'll look at the source of that income. It may be from Pennsylvania, maybe from New York, maybe from California. We will look at the sources, and then we will actually ask you specific questions regarding to that state to make sure we prepare a correct state tax form, and we have the correct residency rules applied to you. Similar to the tax filing deadline on the federal side, you need to file your state tax form by April 15th. So timelines for a refund. If you've used Sprintax already and you're due money back, the IRS will give themselves 6 months in the small print. Generally, we'll see about 6 weeks. The longer you leave it, typically the longer it'll take to get a refund back. Think about it, the IRS are getting more and more refunds up until April 15th. So the later you leave it, the later they'll leave it as well, because they'll be processing higher volumes. Now, in terms of e-filing, the IRS did introduce e-filing a couple of seasons ago. I hope the room isn't bugged by the IRS, but it's not fully fit for purpose for all non-resident cases. And as a result, most non-resident softwares do not have e-filing implemented, not for our own sake, for your sake. We want to make sure that we can file a correct tax return for you guys. And as a result, we have not yet implemented e-filing. So when you go through Sprintax, whilst we'll populate the tax return there and then, you'll just need to print it, sign it, and mail it to the IRS to the address that we provide. We give you clear instructions. What I'd say here is, use a tracked mail service. You can only imagine how many tax returns are falling on the IRS's door. You want to make sure that it's been received by the IRS. So do use a tracked mail service for that case. If you want to check on the status of your tax return, you can use irs.gov/refunds. It'll typically give you a status of where your tax return is at and if a refund has been issued yet. Anyone thinking like this at the moment? It's quite common. If any of you are thinking, oh, I used TurboTax last year, I used resident software last year, what do I do? Or I haven't filed a thing at all for the last 2 years that I've been present in the US. What I'd say is, first, don't panic. Second, do set the record straight. We are in an era of increased scrutiny on all aspects of visa compliance. Your IRS filing obligations are certainly one of them, and certainly no different. If you haven't filed for previous years, I would say catch up, back file. On Sprintax, you're actually able to go back for the last 3 years. And the good news is, if you're due a refund for a tax return within the last 3 years, the IRS are actually happy to issue a refund back. Flip side is, if you owe money to the IRS, they'll chase you all the way since you were in diapers to get the money back. So, not exactly a level playing field, but if it's within the last 3 years, there's potentially money left on the table. If you're thinking, I've misfiled, I've filed with resident software by mistake, use that 1098T that we spoke about and claimed my $1,000 of an educational tax credit. Again, do set the record straight. What you need to do here is what's called the 1040X, which is an amended US tax return. What you can do here is prepare a correct non-resident return for that year, whether it's by yourself or using Sprintax. Use it side by side against your incorrect tax return. Use both together to fill out the 1040X. It essentially says, this is what I input initially, this is what I should have put down, this is the discrepancy. There is an additional service if you wanted Sprintax to prepare an amended tax return for you. It's an additional service. Our tax team will look at it offline for you. But if you wanted to avail of it, you can do so on Sprintax. Which naturally leads into the next slide, the implications of not filing. Very, very important. A lot of questions I get from students is, Ryan, I didn't do anything last year. Is it really that important, or should I just leave it? I guess the question I'd say is, do you really want to test that theory? I was an international student myself. Who's to know when you're going to come back to the US on longer term visas, like H-1Bs or L visas? You're presenting yourself to an embassy officer and he may ask, where's your history of tax compliance? I see you were an international student at UPenn. Where's your history of your tax compliance? Wouldn't it be great to just have a folder to say, I was present at UPenn for 2016, 17, 18. Here's a clear history of my tax compliance for those years. It is part of maintaining visa status here in the US. If you look at the laws set out within your visa, it says you need to oblige by all US laws. One of those is your IRS filing obligations. So it is a really, really important part of being an international student. Similarly, if you owe money, fines, penalties can accrue on that owed money. So important that we clean the slate straight away. Tax scams. Has anyone got a phone call from the IRS or an email from the IRS? I hope not. If you're getting phone calls from the IRS or emails from the IRS, it's not the IRS. We have seen a lot of scams over the years where international students are getting phone calls. They're saying, Ryan, I can see you're studying at UPenn, you're working on campus. Yeah, it looks like you owe us about $1,000 in taxes. If you don't pay this up, we're going to revoke your visa and you're going to get deported home. And you'll be surprised how many cases can actually end up in someone getting scammed. We had a horror story a while ago, a couple of years ago, where an Uber was called for this student who was called up. Uber was organized to pick them up outside their house. They were driven down to a local Apple store and purchased $1,000 in Apple gift vouchers and read the label on the back, and that money was gone. So it only takes a handful of cases for this to be worthwhile for a scam artist, so be very careful here. If there's an issue with your tax return, the IRS will send a letter in the mail. They'll give you time to write back. So if you're getting anything like this, please can you let Ryan in the international office know? We'd like to know as well, because we're almost like the scam watch for our schools. But do pay in mind, this is very important. So the headlines for 2018 in terms of changes. So like I touched base on, the personal exemption of $4,050 has been removed. So for those of you that were working last year, you would have been familiar with this, and you would have realized that if I earned up to that amount, I would have got all of those taxes withheld back. That has been removed, and now if you earn anything over $0 of US source income, one, you'll typically be taxed from the first dollar. Two, you'll need to file a federal tax return. The standard deduction has increased from $6,350 to $12,000. Unfortunately, it can only be used by Indian students and trainees. Can't be used by all other non-resident cohorts. But important to know if you're an Indian student or a trainee. So we helped about 125,000 international students and scholars last year. Of that, if you can see okay, if I was to look at the room here, typically around 9 out of 10 would have got something back. With the changes I just touched base on, I'd probably say we're looking at maybe around 75%, 80%. We've done a few early case studies from schools in terms of the data we've got. However, from last year, 9 out of 10, average refund was in and around $1,000. That will differ from case to case based on the income you earn, based on tax treaties, but important to know. On the state side, typically around 6 out of 10 would have got something back, and average refund is around $300. I'm not trying to push the dollar sign here. This is more really a compliance statement. Whether we owe money, whether we're owed money back, whether we have a nil balance, at the end of the day, we need to do this. We need to file our tax return. So please keep that in mind when you're looking at the refund amount. It's not about the money you're getting back. It's literally the case that you need to do this. So has everyone got their email from the school? You probably got an email yesterday, I think. That'll include the link to Sprintax. It will also include the code that you can use on Sprintax to remove the cost of your federal and 8843 tax return preparation. So once we've clicked on this link, it's literally a case of setting up an account on Sprintax. If you've signed in before, feel free to use your existing account. Once we've chosen our tax year, it'll be 2018. The next thing that we'll do is we'll start to jump into these tax-related questions. The very first step is residency. So we'll ask you about all of your entry and exit dates in and out of the US, the visa types that you were there under, and we will quickly make sure that you're a non-resident for tax purposes, and we'll bring you on to step 2. If it's a case you're a resident, from what the system has understood, we'll stop you at this page. We'll say, it looks like you're a resident for tax purposes. You can't use this software. We don't leave you in the shadows. We'll typically refer you to our partner, which is TurboTax, for resident tax preparation. And in many cases, you can use the free file option on TurboTax. However, if you get past step 1 and into step 2, you'll be a non-resident. We will then start to ask you additional questions. We're a bit like an accordion. We're as straightforward as possible or longer-winded based on your own circumstances. So if you tell Sprintax you didn't earn any income during the year, we'll quickly bring you through to populating the 8843. However, if you did receive income during the year, we'll say, okay, Ryan, what types of income did you receive? Was it a W-2? Was it 2 W-2s? Did you get a 1042S? Did you get a 1099? And what we'll do is we'll literally populate a blank version of that income document so that you can transcribe the information from your own document that you got from the school or your employer onto the system. So literally a case of putting in the information from one document onto the blank version on the software. You'll probably see in the bottom right hand corner there's a pop-up saying got a question. We've got a large bank of FAQs from typical questions that we get from students over the years. If that doesn't answer your question, there's also a facility to our live chat. There's also email support at hello@sprintax.com. So hopefully that will help guide you as you're going through the system. We'll then start to figure out, okay, from that source of income, from the income you've outlined to us, that may have triggered some state filing obligations. And if that's the case, we'll then start to ask you questions regarding state. Apologies, I'm on step 3, let's talk money. This stage is actually, whilst we don't condone it, this outlines income that may have been reported outside of the school or hasn't been reported on an income document. We've had students over the years who played in the local bar for a brown paper bag of cash or sold artwork. Whilst we don't condone it, we do have a facility that you can report income not earned or not reported on, a W-2, 1042S or 1099. So sorry, I jumped ship there. Back to states taxes, we'll figure out and ask additional questions regarding your state filing obligations. And this, will ask you about your entry and exit dates in and out of the state. We'll ask you about the type of accommodation you stayed in, whether it was a student dorm, whether it was your own property, whether you rented a property, and the status of your stay within that state. And then as a result of answering that information, we'll be able to figure out whether you need to file not only 8843, also if you need to file a federal, and also if you need to file a state tax return. So this is the very end of the process. You'll see here that our federal tax return is outlined at the checkout, our state tax return is outlined at the checkout. This is where we'll insert that code that we spoke about. So you'll see at the very bottom, insert access code here. That UPenn code that you got from Ryan or the international office, you'll insert here, and it will remove the cost of that federal return of $35.95 to $49.95. If you have triggered a state filing obligation, you do have the option to also have that prepared on Sprintax. Generally, it's a cost of $25.95 before the end of March, and afterwards it's $29.95. So important to know that. And what we will do then is once that's validated, we will populate the tax return on your behalf. So you'll see in this case, the 1040 NR is populated on your behalf with all the information you provided on Sprintax. And all you then need to do is print it, sign it, follow the instructions that we outline on the tax pack, send it to the IRS, and then you can breathe. Knowing that that's you tax compliant for this year once again, until next year potentially. So I know that was quite heavy, so we'll leave it on a light-hearted note. Does anyone know this chap? Al Capone, one of the most famous gangsters in the US. Anyone know why he was caught? Didn't do his taxes. Not saying you're gangsters or anything, but it is important. Please do your taxes. Happy to answer questions now. If it's about your property down in Miami or your gambling winnings in Vegas, I'm happy to hang around and answer them personally as well. So thanks for staying awake.